This conference will now be recorded.
All right, so let's see what do we have today. So the idea that I do have today is that I'll do a session for the first 30 minutes. So we'll cut the session by 8:30, and then from 8:30 we'll start taking a lot of questions, and we'll also see until now what have we gone so far, and what are the interview questions that can come, and I can take more and more questions there after, let's say, the first half an hour out there as such. Usually on a Friday, I do this. I make sure that we, after we come to a good amount of syllabus, we try to see what are the interview questions and then see what we can prepare out from that and so on and so forth. So let's see. So just give you a quick recap. I have a network today, and inside that particular virtual network, which is a 10.0.0.0/16 address space, I went ahead, created one simple subnet with the address space of 10.0.0.0/24. And inside this particular subnet, we started creating the resources that belong to, or the resources that are responsible for us to create something called as a virtual machine, for which I started off with something called as an NIC card. So we have an NIC card resource which gets attached to that particular subnet and pulls an IP from the pool. And here the IP is something like 10.0.0.4. And once you pull the IP here, you have then a virtual machine that is getting created, which is being attached to the NIC card, and it just inherits this IP. So this becomes now the IP address of this particular virtual machine, which has things like a data disk and an OS disk, of course. Sorry, data disk and an OS disk out here as such. These are two disks that are, let's say, attached to your virtual machine. And later I said, okay, fine, you know what, in order to, let's say, connect to this particular machine, you would need a firewall rule to be in place in the form of a network security group, rules out here. And we allowed a rule called 3389. It's RDP. So we said, please allow a port number called 3389. And also we went ahead and we gave this particular, let's say, virtual machine a public IP address. So the public IP also got attached to your NIC card only. So if you see, these are all the resources that are getting attached to your NIC card. And using this particular public IP address, I as a user, or I as a backend administrator, I am going ahead into this particular public IP and able to perform. I am able to perform something like an RDP out here as such. Again, how did I do that? This is my virtual machine, which is nothing but the demo VM, and this has a public IP address. So let me give it a second to, let's say, load this out. I just copied this public IP address, went into my desktop. I said remote desktop connection, and I opened this particular connection out here. I pasted this IP. The username yesterday, it's just taking, or it's just caching that particular username out here, and I'll just say connect. And once that's done, I just go ahead and give the password to this particular machine, or the password that I've set, and I'll say yes. And once that's done, I kind of log inside this particular machine, or I am inside an RDP session into this particular machine. So I was doing something that's recent. This is the RDP session that you're able to see. But yes, something like this. Close this as well. Okay. So this is how the machine will, this is how you will be able to see this particular machine out here as such. So I'm now inside an RDP session of this particular machine out here as such. So this is what we did in order to make sure to enable the RDP. So firstly, we put the port in. We said 3389 is a port that I want to, let's say, enable out here. And after that, I said that, okay, fine. Once the port is enabled, I had a public IP address attached to the machine, and using the public IP address number, which is something like 20 something like that, 2016 and 195 107. I went ahead and I used the RDP, the remote desktop connection application on my machine, and then I went inside an RDP session to this particular machine out here. Now, if you were to ask me, is this the end goal that I wanted to achieve? Not really. This is just for a backend administrator. I am an administrator working in the backend. I am an administrator working in the background, and I want to connect to this particular machine, so I do an RDP and connect to this particular machine out here. But the end goal is that I have some amount of code that let's say code with me. I have a developer who's written some code, let's say in the form of HTML or something like that. And what I am expected to do is this. I want to host my code on this particular machine. Instead of hosting my code on a server, which I need to buy, I'm avoiding that particular route, and I'm going here and I'm saying, okay, fine, you know what? I have my code and I'll host my code on this particular machine. And the idea is this: if a user from the internet uses my IP address called 20 dot something 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 and hits this IP address, meaning hitting this IP address is nothing but just like you put a website called www.google.com. I'm putting this IP address into my browser. This IP address should take this request, get diverted inside this particular machine, interact with the code, and in return, give this particular user the actual application. Meaning, I now want to convert this machine into an application server or a web server, is what you can say in a very simple term. So I now want to run something called as a web server or an application server on this particular machine out here as such. But before that, let's do one thing. Let's take the IP of this particular machine. Go to my browser. I'll paste this IP here and I'll say enter. So I would just want to see what exactly this IP really returns out here. What exactly this IP really returns in written, or what it really gives us in written. And let's see what we can do with that. So let's wait for some time and let's understand what it gives out here as such. Now, no matter how many times I do this, it's just going to give me this particular error telling me that the site cannot be reached. The reason being, I have not put any code on top of this particular machine, and I have not also told this machine what do you need to do. See, this is a simple machine out here. You created the machine. I did not assign any role to this particular machine. There is no role whatsoever attached to this particular machine. And in order for you to go ahead and convert this machine into a web application server or a application server or a web server out here, you need to assign a role to this particular machine called web server role. Now, this is something that you cannot go ahead and do with your home operating system. With your home OS, you cannot do this. It's a server operating system that I created. That's the very reason I created something called as a Windows Server 2019 operating system out here as such. So what I'll be doing right now is that I'll go inside this particular server and I will look for a piece of software called Server Manager. It's a desktop application that you get whenever you go ahead and let's say create a server out here. This is something that you will not get, you cannot get when you go ahead and let's say create a home operating system. I'll just close this and it's telling okay fine, configure the server. I'll say add a role to this particular server. And here I would like to add a role. It's telling okay fine, before you begin, this is what it is. The administrator has should have a strong password and etc. A couple of terms and conditions. I'll say next. It's telling what do you want to really do. Do you want to really go ahead and let's say do something called remote desktop installation, or do you want to add a role? I'll say, you know what, I want to add a role or a feature based installation. I'll say next. It's telling, okay, fine, which is a server you want to, let's say, install this role on. On a network, you can have multiple servers. Now it's telling, okay, fine, I see something like a demo VM here. Is this a server that you want to, let's say, perform this? I'll say yes, this is the server. This is the only thing that I have. I'll say next. And okay, fine, this is, yeah, I'll close out and I'll say next. I'll just scroll down. There is a role called web server role. Now, this machine can perform, as I said earlier, this machine can perform multiple things. It can do something like a domain service. It can do something like a federation service. It can act like a DNS server. It can act like a fax server. Meaning, if you want a fax service, it can also do that. But I'm now telling that, okay, fine, you know what? Please go ahead and install something called as a web server in bracket IIS, Internet Information Services. This is a way in order. This is a way in order. I mean, this is the way in which I'm going ahead and converting my machine into an application server out here. I'll say add the features. Yes, this is what I want to add. I'll say next, and I'm not, let's say, touching anything out here. I'll say next, 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 and go ahead and install this out. So I'm going ahead installing a role called web server IIS on top of my machine, and this is a way in which I am converting my machine into an application server, which means I'm telling my machine that, hey, you know what? If someone from the internet tries to talk to you over a public IP address, please go ahead, written them some random page or written them the code that you have. That's what I'm telling this machine here out here as such. I want to tell that I'm installing this particular role-based installation, this particular feature installation out here as such. Again, this is something that you can achieve with PowerShell also. It's a simple command telling install role and all that stuff. So that's something that you can also do with PowerShell. We'll also look at that. And it'll take like a minute or so to go ahead and, let's say, install this particular role. And once that's done, let's come back to our browser and see what kind of a page it returns, or what kind of, let's say, a content it returns out here as such. So any quick questions until here? Anyone who's stuck, or any questions until here that I can take? Anyone? Any questions that I can take till here? And now it's telling installation has succeeded. I'll just close this. I'll just come back into my browser. I'll try to, let's say, refresh my browser once again and see what really happens right now. Now this particular machine is assigned a role called as a web server, so it knows what to do, let's say, it knows what to do, what not to do, and all that stuff. So let's refresh this out. Let's wait for a minute, and you will all likely get the same page again. So refresh is done. You will all likely get the same page again. Now the reason being, see, the machine knows what it needs to perform. The machine knows that, okay, fine, you know what, I am a web server, so I need to, let's say, deliver some kind of a content over the internet. It knows that, but the network security group rule that you have in place is still blocking your machine out here as such. Yesterday, I just went ahead and enabled something called as an RDP rule out here. I said RDP connections are allowed, but I did not never said I never really said here that internet connections are allowed. For which I add one more rule out here onto my NSG block, telling source is any, destination is any, service here. I'll say it's a HTTP service working on a port number called port 80. I'll say it's a HTTP internet service working on a port number called 80, and I'll just go ahead and I'll say add. So I'm adding a rule here telling that these connections are allowed. If you go ahead and take this particular IP, and if someone is trying to talk to this particular IP over the internet, this particular connection is allowed, and please go ahead and allow this out, is what I'm now trying to tell my rule out here. So let's refresh this out. Now I have a rule. It will take somewhere around couple 1 or 2 minutes for this rule to come into effect. Once that's done, let's try to refresh this out, and as and when I refresh this out, it's now able to, in written, give me something called as an internet information services page out here. So it's telling, okay, fine, you know what, it's telling, okay, internet information service is now running, and if you click on this, it will take you to the documentation of IIS and tell you, okay, fine, how do you manage IIS and so on and so forth, how do you put your own code and all that stuff. But what it tells you right now is that now, even if you go ahead, and I'll just paste this link out here in the chat window. Even if you go ahead at your end, try to hit this particular service, I mean, any part of the world you are, it's going to load this particular page telling that, okay, fine, internet information services is actually loading out here as such. Is any questions that I can take to you? Anyone? Any questions that I can take till you? But one curiosity that I have here is that how is this page even coming here? How is this image even coming here as such? To answer that, let's go back into the machine. And once we get into this machine, right? When you install something called as an IIS role on top of your server, or when you go ahead and let's say do some kind of an IIS installation out here, the IIS installation will create a folder inside your C drive called inetpub. This is the folder that I'm really looking at, called inetpub out here. It's an internet publishing folder, which means whatever is there inside this particular folder. Let's go inside that particular folder. Inside this, you have, let's say, some history, logs, and everything. And there is one very important folder here called www root, a root folder. We call this as a root folder of the website. If I get inside this particular folder, and if I look at this particular image, it's the same image that I have on the browser as well, which means whatever content is there. And there is one more page here called, let's say, iistart.html page. I have a HTML page as well. So if I just remove this and if I put my own HTML page here, if I just open a notepad and I'll say my own HTML page, and if I want to, let's say, create a HTML page, very simple. The syntax of HTML starts something like this: h1 heading 1. I'll say this is IIS server, and I'll just close this out. I'll just save this as something like this. Let me go here into the same folder. So I have to save it inside the same folder in order for this to work, into the root folder. And in here, I'll just save this as a default.html file. And if I do that, if I end up doing that, and if I now refresh this particular page, it's saying forbidden and all that stuff because there's nothing inside that particular folder. But if I do a /default.html, it's just going to load whatever is there inside your HTML page out here, telling now it's telling, okay, fine, you know what, this is an IIS server. In this place, meaning in the place of this particular default HTML page, you can probably have your entire website running. For example, I'll say some download HTML templates here. Some sample HTML templates is what I can get on the internet. So I can go and just download that out. For example, let's say I'll just go here. I have one simple website out here. I'll just copy this entire link into my browser on the machine, and I can simply go download this entire HTML content. I'll just hit the download button. I'll just save this out, and this should download an entire HTML document for me. I'll say extract, and in place of that particular default HTML page that I have given, this is the entire folder is saying source and all that stuff. Let's see. There is HTML, there is CSS. Okay, this is a little complicated website where it's saying all the source and all that stuff. Let's see. This package.json. This is the CSS. Let me see if there's a proper HTML that I can use. Yes, there's a HTML file. So let's put it in. I'll just download this out. And let me open that folder out, and again this I'll just unzip this out. And once that's done, let me go here and let me just get all the contents here, and let me go inside my C drive. And in place of that particular default.html page that I have, I'll just delete this out. I'll just paste the entire content that I have, that I just downloaded. And if I come to the browser, just remove this out and refresh the screen. Let me get the URL once again. And if I just go ahead and let's say refresh my entire page out here, I will have an entire website loading right now, telling that this is some industrial website or something like this. And in place of this, what, you can have your own content. If you're a developer, you can develop your own content, place your own content, and you have your own website that is running out here. So right now you are a user who's going ahead interacting with this particular IP address. This IP address is diverting you inside the machine, getting the code from this particular machine, and delivering the code or delivering the content over the internet in the form of a website. And for this to work, I firstly added a role called IIS on top of this particular machine. This gives you a folder called inetpub and something called www root. And inside that particular root folder is where I placed all the content that I downloaded from the internet, and it started working. It is as simple as that. So, which means that you can, as let's say a developer, if you are a developer, HTML developer or something like that, you can simply go ahead and write a code, place it inside your server, and this now becomes a hosting platform. This now goes ahead and gets a hosting platform out for you. And also, one thing that I did is I added a rule called Rule 80 on my network security group rules out here in order to allow the communication over the internet. Now, one thing Azure gives you here is that right now I'm using this particular, let's say, number to go ahead and interact with my website. If I don't want that, in your virtual machine, you can configure something called as a DNS name, meaning instead of using an IP address, you can use an actual website name out here. So you can click here. It's saying not configured. So I'll say, okay, fine, you know what I want to configure. So I'll say configure. This will take me to the public IP address. And it says, okay, fine, you know what, you have something called as a DNS name label. So I'll say this is a test VM and .east2s2.cloudapp.azure.com. This is going to give you a fully qualified domain name called testvm.something dot cloudapp.azure.com out here. I'll just say save this out. And instead of calling now your IP address, instead of just going in and calling an IP address out here, which is a little difficult to, let's say, go ahead and remember, you can call your domain name a fully qualified domain name. So if I just copy this out, if I just go back to my VM, I'll just refresh this out. I now have a DNS name here telling it is testvm.something. So instead of calling this particular IP address, I can place the DNS name and I can refresh this out. And this is again going to give me the same website back again. So either now you call the IP address or you call the DNS name out here, works in the same way out here as such. So this is what I have done in order to, let's say, create a simple website that is running on, let's say, my virtual machine platform out here as such. Is any questions that I can take?
So Microsoft maintains the DNS as a service provider to give that
Yes,
DNS
Microsoft.
service.
Yes, Microsoft maintains the DNS. Here in this case, a good question. Microsoft maintains this out, which means what the question here is this. The
Is
question
it a
here,
service? I mean, DNS as a service, or
just a second, just a second. Just hold on. We'll talk about firstly what DNS really is, and then I'll talk about how basically it maintains the DNS out here so that people can follow what we're really talking about out here. So what the question here is this. See, you put a website name out here, or you put, let's say, something called as a DNS name. It's a domain name services. Domain name services. And this is a domain with an extension called eastus2.cloudapp.azure.com. Now, when someone goes to this particular website called testvm.eastus2.cloudapp.azure.com, I'll say testvm. Something .azure.com. Guys, can you please go on mute? I'm getting okay. Okay. So when someone visits this particular website called testvm.azure.com, your browser has to know what is the IP address that is attached to it. What is the IP address that is attached to this particular website out here? Your browser has to understand that this is called as a DNS resolution. The question here is who will help you in this particular DNS resolution and who is going to maintain this particular DNS record? It's Microsoft Azure. This is a domain that Azure is maintaining out here with the name called EastGS to something like this. And if I just copy this domain, just the domain out here, and probably go to a PowerShell in my system and just run a command called resolve-DNS name and give the name here. Say enter. My PowerShell is able to understand that okay, fine, if you give this particular address, I'll need to reach out to a public IP address called 2069.195.107, which is attached to a virtual machine that is hosting my code. This entire service or this entire resolution is now taken care by Microsoft. I did not do anything. I just went ahead, said, okay, fine, this is a domain name that I want to register. And these domains are owned by Microsoft. They provide this to you as a service. Does it answer your question? It was this your question, and does that answer your question out here?
Yeah, I mean, uh, like for example, in AWS we have Route 53 as a DNS service. Similarly, do we have any service like that in Azure?
Okay, so you're talking about the DNS services in Azure. Yes, you have something called as DNS services in Azure. When you say DNS, you have something called DNS zones in Azure, private or public DNS zones out here. But here in this case, right, it's a domain name label that you're giving to a machine. I'm not really providing, let's say, a DNS service out here. I'm just giving a domain name label, and Azure in the background is creating its own. Like this is something that you cannot really control. Azure in the background is creating its own DNS, let's say, name records and associating your, let's say, domains out there. But if you want to do purely something like a DNS, yes, Azure has something called DNS public forwarding. You have
So
something called DNS
you
forward
can purchase a domain name, right?
from Azure.
Yeah.
No, you cannot purchase a domain name
So
from
you're
Azure.
talking about only internal DNS, not external public domain, public DNS, right? You're not talking about
This
public DNS.
is just a second. This is a public DNS, right? This
Oh, no,
is
no,
a
no.
public DNS name, hmm?
If I want to create my own IS, like my own domain,
Which is
like I
like
get a,
dot something dot com.
yeah, mycompany.com, for example.
Which means yes, which means that you have to purchase it. Yes, not from Azure,
Yeah,
but
not from
from an
Azure. Oh,
external entity,
okay, that's
like
what my
GoDaddy, Bluehost, whatever it is
right.
there.
Okay, AWS does that actually. They sell the
Mhm.
domains.
Okay. Yes. Any more questions, guys? As I promised, I will hold the session here, and I'll start taking more and more
But
questions. So, please.
if I have to host my own domain, public domain,
Mhm.
then I need to create the name server records and I need to copy those into the GoDaddy and all that stuff. I need to do it, right?
Yes. Yes.
And security of that. Okay.
Correct. So yes, you have to purchase your domain, and you have to, let's say, do a name registration and all that stuff. Yes.
Hello, sir.
Good, sir.
Sir, in this page, public IP address is dynamic and standard, sir. Static, sir.
Okay, dynamic and static. So let's look at that. This is a static public IP address. What I mean by that is, let's go there. So yesterday, when we were creating a public IP address, right? So we were going ahead and let's say doing or created a public IP address out here, and we created a standard public IP address. It's a standard public IP address out here. And always standard public IPs come with a static configuration, which means if I go back into my configuration out here of the public IP address here, this is a static assignment. This is always a static assignment out here, which means that even if you restart the virtual machine that is associated with this particular public IP, you are going to get the same public IP out here as such. But again, a static public IPs are costlier in nature than when you compare it with, let's say, a dynamic public IP address out here. In my case, I could have also gone ahead and created something called as a dynamic public IP here in this place. I could have done a basic, let's say I could have done a basic public IP address. Reason being, I'm using a domain name label. So instead of giving you as a user the IP address, I'm going ahead and giving something called as a fully qualified domain name of my website. And it is Azure's headache to map this to, let's say, the IP out here as such, whether it being static or dynamic. So you do not have to, let's say, take care of the mapping out here as such. But to answer to your question, this is a static, and dynamic changes every time when you restart your machine out here as such. Does that answer your question, Trinath?
Yes, sir.
Yes, any more questions, guys?
Yeah, Kiran.
Good, please.
Yeah, you mapped that DNS IP IP to that name, fully qualified domain name.
Hmm.
And what is that used for in real time environment?
What is the use in the real-time environment? Just see, is this easier for you to remember, or is this easier for you to remember?
Yeah, that is okay. It is for internal purpose only. No? We need to outside end users. They don't know. No?
End users, they don't know. They should
They
not know.
won't.
Yeah, they should not really know. This is for your, this is internally you are going ahead and mapping this out. But my question is that
Okay.
why will you as an end user, or why do you as an end user even want to know this? You just need a website name called www dot something, right? You just need a website name,
Yeah.
and that website name should always and always be mapped to an IP address. For example, let's take the example of, let's say, google.com. So if I go ahead and do a resolution out here telling it is google.com, so do you know the IP address of a google.com, or do you just know the fully qualified domain name? It's always this address that you know. But if you do this, they're
Yes.
also going to give you the IP address that is attached out here as such. But is this something that you are concerned about? No. This something that I as a google.com I'm concerned about to map this out. So it's always better to expose a domain name to your end users rather than the IP address out here, and that's the reason I mapped it out.
If you want my own domain means we want to purchase in outside only.
Yes, you have to purchase it outside and then map it to, let's say, this particular IP address out here as such.
In real time it is going on purchasing outside only, but in if you want to if in Microsoft they are giving their own domain.
Yes, in Microsoft they're giving their own domain. That's correct. In if you want to purchase it out, if you want to purchase, let's say, your own domain, then yes, you are free to do it and then map to this particular address.
Okay.
This domain suffix cannot be changed, right? This is static.
Yes, this is static. The domain suffix cannot be changed. This is something that I'm not controlling. And also, if you see, it is east-us2, the region where you're creating this public IP address,
Region.
.cloudapp.azure.com.
Yeah.
So it's a region that changes, but the cloudapp.azure.com, right? That remains constant.
IP address will change, no, sir, after reconnecting the data.
That's fine, sir. I mean, in my case, IP address is not changing. It's a static IP address. So even though I restart my machine, if I do that, I'm going to literally get the same IP address. I can show the same thing. So if I go ahead into my virtual machine, if I restart my virtual machine out here, it'll get restarted. All good. The IP address won't change. And in case you have a dynamic IP, if you have a dynamic, even that doesn't matter to me because I have exposed something called as a domain name to my user. I've given this to you. This will always and always map to an IP address that is present here, irrespective of whether it's static or dynamic. But in this case, since you have a static IP address already, it's not going to change. You are literally going to get the same IP address out here as such because you've already paid for Azure for a static IP address out here. Does that answer your question? Yes, any more questions, guys? Any more questions in this particular architecture on what are the services that we use and so on and so forth? Anyone, any more questions here?
In this scenario, port 80 and 443 is open.
In this scenario, only 80 is open. I did not open 443 because 443 is a HTTPS service. I'm not doing a HTTPS right now. It's just a HTTP. My website is still not secure. To secure it, you would need something called as an SSL certificate to be attached, and only then you can open a 443 out here as such. So in this scenario, if you look at it, I only opened in my networking. If I go into the networking, I only opened a port 80 out here. 443 is not even open. Still doesn't matter for me. Website will work. Reason being, I am connecting with an unsecured connection out here as such. Yes, any more questions, guys? So let's look at.
SSL, it is
Good.
SSL also given from Microsoft only, no?
It depends upon the kind of service that you're going for again. In an infrastructure, sorry, in a virtual machine service that I have created, which is generally called as an infrastructure as a service. I'll also talk about what is infrastructure as a service as such. SSL is not given to you by Microsoft, which means securing your website is your own responsibility. But there are services called platform as a service, like web application service and so on and so forth. In those cases, SSL is given to you by Microsoft. Here, SSL is not provided to you by Microsoft out here. You will have to create your own SSL.
Okay.
Yes, any more questions, guys? So let's look at this. Let's see what have we covered so far and what can be the interview questions out here, especially from, let's say, the virtual machine point of view or from the storage accounts point of view and etc. Let's understand what are the questions again. So let's remove this out. And again, guys, just a heads up, we have questions. I have, let's say, placed questions out here inside, let's say, one of my links out here telling its storage account and etc. So I'll just send this across to you all once again. Please bookmark it somewhere so that you can be using this, and I'll keep updating the questions on a regular basis. So let's look at this. We started off with something like storage. I mean, even before storage accounts, we started off with RBACs, resource groups, and etc. But the questions are mostly asked on something like a storage account service, and the questions can be, or the questions will be, scenario based questions. Like, mostly if I am an interviewer and I'm trying to, let's say, interview you out, It's mostly going to be scenario based questions out here. So let's say that you are sitting in an interview and one of the questions can be something like this, that I want a storage account service to be replicated, or I want my data to be replicated across the region. And so the first point is that replication across the region. So data replication across the region out here. And the clause added to this is that whenever there is an issue with my primary storage account, I want to do something called as a failover, meaning I want to go read my data from a secondary data center out here. Now the interviewer can ask, what kind of a replication or what kind of a redundancy would you be using here? Is it LRS? Is it ZRS?
GRS.
Is it
GRS.
GRS? So what kind of a replication would you be using out here as such to
GRS, right? GRS. Last one.
GRS? Yes,
GRS.
GRS will give you a replication across region, but will it give you a failover? Not really. It won't give you a failover out here. You need
ZRS.
a
Okay, so
RAGRS. Yes, ZRS is not going to give you a replication across the zone or across the region. It's just a
across
zone redundancy. There is something called RAGRS out here. Read access geo redundant storage. RA. The RA here is telling that, okay, fine, you know what? If you have an issue with your primary endpoint, meaning if your primary service were to go down, meaning if that region for some reason is going down, you can perform or you can initiate something called as a failover, meaning you can fail over to a secondary endpoint. For example, I created my primary service in East US2. The secondary service can be something like Central US or West US. Let's say West US out here. Now the selection of the secondary region is something that we cannot control. This is something that we do not have a say on. It's completely based on the Microsoft backend algorithm. Now the point here is that if this region is to go down, can I move to this region and get my data from here? Yes, it is possible, and that's where failover in a storage account comes into picture. Storage account failover. In disaster recovery for your storage account, and you can go ahead and let's say choose a kind of redundancy out here. It's setting copies asynchronous and so on and so forth. But a read access is going to let's say go ahead and give you something called as a failover, let's say capability out here. So it says how the storage how the storage account fails over, what happens during a failover and so on and so forth. So that is what is, or that's like one of the questions that they can ask you in an interview out here on how do you perform a failover. Without directly asking you how do you perform a failover, they're going to check whether do you understand the concept of let's say replication, and then can you relate that particular replication to a failover concept out here as such.
So
One
this
of the questions.
failover is automatic failover or a manual one?
No, it's a manual failover. It's not automatic. It's a user initiated failover. So you are expected to go ahead and let's say perform a perform a failover out here as such. So it's not an automatic, it's a manual failover that you need to perform. Yes. Any questions? Any questions here?
No, by default, I think the data will be replicated across the availability zones, right? It is not.
Yes, by default the data is going to be replicated.
So if
But can
one,
you, yeah,
so one of the zone goes down, so the data still
mhm,
is available, right? The copy of the data is available in other zones.
is available, but can you read it? No. Your data is available, but can your application really read it? Your application cannot read it. It's just for your data protection is what they're giving you. Let's say the additional copies of the data. But can you use the data at that point, that particular point in time? That's a no. You cannot really
Or that,
use the data at that particular
or
point
you
in time.
cannot access the data. You mean if
You
it
cannot
is
access the data.
copy?
That's yes. You cannot really access the data. You will have to, just in case if you want to get that data out there, you will have to create a support request with Microsoft telling that okay, fine, I need to get that data from a secondary copy. This is crucial data and so on and so forth. Reason being, if your company is running a storage account which has critical production data, they try to put it in something like RAGRS out here, so that in case you have a failure, you can read it from a secondary endpoint.
So what my understanding in AWS is
Mm-hmm.
the data when you first put the data,
Mm-hmm.
so that will automatically AWS service will automatically make multiple copies, at least
Okay.
three copies in three availability zones, right?
Okay.
So when the data is lost, that is where the
Mm-hmm.
SL is defined. So what is the
Mm-hmm.
durability and availability? Right? It
Correct.
is 99.999 and whatever, right? They
Mm-hmm.
give it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So which means that data is available in other zones to access it.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't need, I don't think we need to replicate it to because
Mm-hmm.
it is available, right? I mean, you need to replicate
See,
to access it.
replication is something that is taken by care by the cloud provider.
Yes.
Right. So replication is taken care by the cloud provider. But in case of failure, can an application read it? Is what I'm really, let's say, looking at. Can an application really read it? No, it's not a readable copy. It's a protected copy.
So then
It's
what
not
is
a
high
readable copy that you
availability? I
put.
mean, in cloud in general, high
Mm-hmm.
availability, they talk about high availability, right? The data is
Right.
highly available.
Mm-hmm. The
So
data
if the
when they say
application,
highly, yes, the data when they say is highly available, you're talking about the primary endpoint out here. You're telling that okay, fine, in a primary endpoint, you can go for a fail, or you can, let's say, have a possibility of 0.0001% of something like failure. That's what they're really talking about. Now, if you look at the documentation out here on redundancy or storage account,
no, high availability means the data is available, but we are not able to access it unless it gets replicated. Is that what it is?
can you come with the question again, please?
No, high availability, the definition of high
Mm-hmm.
availability in any cloud for that matter,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So is the data available, but you
Mm-hmm.
cannot access it in case of a in case of a zone failure.
See, the meaning of high availability is this: is that, let's say, you're trying to access your data. Out of every 100 requests, is your data coming back? Meaning, are you able to access the data?
Hmm.
How many times? Like, how many times out of 100 are you able to access your data? Which, in my case, let's say something like, if I go to LRS, it's something like 99.11 times 9 out here, which is telling me that okay, fine, you can access your data. I'm also giving you a durability. Now, there are two things that this
Availability,
particular
durability,
documentation is
yeah,
saying. Yes,
yeah.
availability and durability. It's telling, you know what, I will give you an availability of this one, which means
Hmm.
that in case you have a primary endpoint, server one, in the server one, I'll make sure to maintain the server one so that out of every 100, 99.11 times 9, your data is coming back. But in case of disaster, that's what it's telling you. So, if you want to migrate to other things, then you have to use these things out here as such, which is telling you that yes, will have your other copies, but these are just copies out here that I'm storing for durability, not availability. This is not availability.
Hmm.
This is availability that they're talking about. Now, when you also want this data to be available somewhere else, that's where read access comes into picture. It's telling, okay, fine, you know what? Yes, it is available and it's also durable. So you'll have to read between the lines out here as such.
So we get
Mhm.
only read-only access if one of the zone fails to other zones, right? To the
No,
data.
region fails. When one of the region fails
Region.
is when you
Oh, we
get
are
a
talking
yes,
about region. Okay,
a
not the.
region availability, or not a zone. We're talking about a region. So if you just come back here, this is what we're talking about really. It's a regional, let's say, failure is what, let's say, I'm talking about out here as
Got it.
such.
Regional failure, yeah, I understand. I mean, we need to migrate, but zone failure, I mean, it automatically the data is available to access, right?
Right.
So that okay. I was referring
Mhm.
zone availability, which is automatically available. The data is available for the application
Right.
if one copy
Correct.
fails.
Correct.
But
And
in
but
regional,
when you are talking about regional, then you'll have to initiate a failover. You'll have to tell, okay, fine, I'll
right?
initiate a failover out there.
Because those
Then
are two different
Mhm.
data centers, right? Yeah.
Data centers out there. That's true. Yes. Any more questions, guys?
So what is your second question? You said if you can go back to the question. First question is the regional outage.
Regional outage, and can I do a failover? If in case, the
Okay,
first
in
question is
case of
that can I
regional failure.
replicate?
Okay.
Yes. In case of regional, in case of regional failure was my second question. So the first question itself, eliminates these two options because LRS and ZRS are talking about a particular
Zone level
region.
and local. Yeah, it is
Yes,
not regional.
zone and local level out here. But the GRS and RAGRS is coming at a regional level, and RAGRS is something which will allow you to go ahead and do a failover and read the data from, let's say, a secondary endpoint out here as such.
Okay, got it. So this option, regional failover, is not there in AWS.
Okay. Is any more questions, guys? And there can be multiple questions out here. For example, let's say you come up with a question, or the interviewer comes up with a question telling that, what, I have some data, like I have something around thousands of files of data out here, and after a period of time, let's say about 30 days, you want this data automatically to be deleted. Can I achieve this? If I have to achieve this, then what do I have to configure inside a storage account? Can anyone
Lifecycle
take this
policy.
question? Lifecycle policies, exactly. I need sorry, I need something called as, yes, I need something called as lifecycle policies that I need to create in place, put it in place, so that I can go ahead and delete my data after, let's say, something like a number of days. I can have multiple lifecycle policies defined. I can create the lifecycle policy either with a PowerShell script or with an ARM template. I can automate it out as per the requirement. I can go ahead and automate this out as such out there as such. A couple of questions out there that they can ask, and one of the very popular questions that they, straightforward, one of the very popular questions they ask is that what is the difference between a shared access signature in a storage account versus an access key, and what do you prefer going with? Is it a SAS token or is it an access key that you want to expose?
It says has token always because it is temporary in nature.
Temporary in nature also, it gives you a control
Restriction with
what you can
restriction.
do. Yes, it's a restriction that you can have. Exactly. You can say whether someone can read or someone can write or what someone can really do out here as such. So shared access signature is always something which is restricted. An access key is something which is unrestricted. And in order for you to invalidate the access key, you should do something called as a key rotation. You should do something called as a key rotation out here in order for you to, let's say, go ahead and invalidate an earlier key out here as such. And see, an interviewer can also look at things like, okay, fine, are you able to relate two different concepts? Like, for example, they're telling, what, I don't want to expose my storage account to the internet. I don't want to do that. I want to secure my storage account. That's where your virtual network comes into picture. A virtual network out here, which comes into picture out here. And if you want to completely disable, see, one thing that you have to understand here is that adding a virtual network to the storage account is going to make sure that the storage account requests, meaning the requests that are coming to the storage account, are contained within the network. But this is not going to eliminate the public IP address that the storage account has. Which means that any user, if they have, let's say, the required permissions, they can go ahead and whitelist their own IPs and they can still go to the public IP and, let's say, go ahead and, let's say, get the data out here. If you want completely a private access to your storage account, there is a concept called private endpoint. We'll talk about that on what are private endpoints out here. And to talk about private endpoints, firstly, I'll have to cover what is networking, what is private DNS zones, what are routes and all that stuff. And then I'll have to come to the private endpoints. So I'm just waiting on this particular lecture. I'm just waiting on our, I'm just waiting on our networking to go through. And then I'll come down into something called as a private endpoints out here. Again, I just want you all to go ahead, look at these questions. Look at these questions on what kind of different questions that you can really get out here. That what is, let's say, an ARM template, and etc. It's something that I haven't really discussed about, but we'll talk about that in automation section out here as such. And what I want you all to do, guys, is again tomorrow and day after, if you all remember, we have the automation classes. please make sure to revise the basic concepts like for loop, for each loop, and etc. And please try to look at what we have done in the last session on how did we create a resource group, how did we create a storage account, how did we do the automation for the same thing out here. And in tomorrow's class, we'll just elaborate that. We'll see how do you create a container inside a storage account. If you're able to create one, then how do you create multiple? If you are able to create a container, can you upload a blob inside the container using your script? And what is the advantage of that, and so on and so forth out here as such. So this is what I'm going to discuss in the coming classes out here.
7 a.m. tomorrow, Karan?
7 a.m. Yes,
Tomorrow and day after, both right?
that's right. Sorry, yes, that's right. It's tomorrow and day after. Yes, any questions, guys, before I close? Okay, thank you, guys, and have a good day ahead, and we'll meet tomorrow. Thank you.